Well, when my mother and my dad got married and had the only child together, March the 19th, 1948, and that was Robert Leon Williams Jr. My daddy decided that he wanted to name me after him. And my mother and my dad had already made and came up with an agreement that with their first child, if it would be a girl, my mother would name it. But if it would be a boy, my daddy would have that option to name it. And that's where it all came down to Robert Leon Williams Jr., March the 19th, 1948. And later on, 5 years later, in 1953, my mother and dad separated. And in 1954, they got a divorce. And my dad moved to San Antonio. And by this time, my auntie had already passed. And therefore, the only somebody that was living at 3816 Cobb Street was my mom, Lillian Ames Williams, and her uncle and my great uncle, and it was Joe Hall. And all the property and the rent houses, my mother took the responsibility of keeping them up and managing it and managing the money and the property that my auntie had left for her and her husband. And after my mother had graduated from Jack Yates and my father had moved on, then she got a job at the VA hospital. And one of the most successful people that was real close to our family was the princess. That's why when I was born, my mother and my dad and my uncle, Joe Hall, made Mr. and Miss Prince, the owners of the Groovy Grill, to be my godparents. And raised up at 3816 Cobb Street. That was our address. My mother had taken on another close friend of hers. She never had any sisters, but she had a close friend of hers when she was pregnant, living next door to her at 3814 Cobb Street, and her name was Eula Mae Neal. And Miss Neal and my mother both had something in common. They always wanted to have a sister, and they didn't have one, so they took it on them own to have a sister, to be sisters. In fact, when Miss Eula Mae Neal, that wasn't Eula Mae Neal, her name was Myrtle Neal, take it back. When she got pregnant, she thought she would never have a son because she already had 3 daughters, and her and Mr. Neal thought they would never have a son. And on December the 23rd, 1946, my mother went to the hospital with Miss Eula Mae, with Miss Myrtle Neal, to deliver their first boy, and his name was Marvin Neal. And when my mother was pregnant in 1947, Miss Neal and my mother was always close. So on the night of March 19, 1948, Miss Neal went to the hospital with my mother when I was born. And those two was just like two sisters. And me and the Neals have always been close to each other. And Marvin Neal and me, Robert Williams, have always been like brothers. And the Neal family have always been like sisters to me. In fact, when Miss Neal had the last child, my mother went to the hospital with her. And they thought Marvin was going to have another brother. But instead, Miss Neal had another daughter. Her name was Alva Neal. And my mother loved her all, but she asked Miss Neal, she already had 3 girls, why don't she let her have the baby? And Miss Neal told my mother that, look at it this way, Lillian. Now Boo and Marvin have a baby sister. And that's Alva Howard now, today. But as we get back and we look back on the history of Cobb Street, my mother had so much love on Cobb Street. And when I was born, everybody knew me because I was Lillian's only child. Mr. Solomon lived next door across the street. And what can I say about the Land family, Perry Land and his wife, the Land family? My mother looked upon them way before when she first came to Houston and stayed with my Aunt Rosie. Those two, Miss Maggie Solomon and Miss Land, Miss Dora Mae Davis, who she always took as a big sister to her. And Miss Land, all of those people, my mother looked upon them as being her parents, because they were much older than her. But as we look back at 3816 Cobb Street and the raising of Lillian's only child, and that's Boo. But this ain't about Boo today. This is about Lillian Ames Williams. And when my godfather and godmother, the princess, told my mother about a job and got my mother a job at the VA hospital, that's when she ran into my stepfather, Mr. Casey Jones, Phyllis Wheatley, 1943, out of Fifth Ward. And her and Casey Jones was married in 1955. And I had my stepfather to help raise me all the way to my mother passed until he passed away. He was just like my father, because I never had an opportunity to be around my father for Father's Day, Christmas, my birthday. These days, people that got a father don't even realize how valuable a father is. They take it for granted till they don't have a father. But those things happen in life. And I'm so grateful for a stepfather like Casey Jones. I'm so grateful for a mother like Lillian Ames Williams Jones today, to not tell me nothing negative about my daddy, and not having other people to tell me things negative about my daddy. But these are good things that have came upon me and Lillian Ames Williams Jones. Now she is Lillian Jones. And when she started working at the VA hospital, working in the cafeteria, now she got to find somebody to keep her baby. And that's me. And that's when my Aunt Pearlie came in. My Aunt Pearlie was adopted because that was my daddy's sister. It wasn't but 2 people in my daddy's family. That was him and his sister, Pearlie Munson Harvey. And my daddy. Those was only 2 that was in the family. They didn't have a mother and a father. They was both raised as an orphanage by the Munson family. But I'm here to say that Lillian worked hard at the VA hospital. She also managed the apartments that was in the back of the house at 3816 Cobb Street, and also the little hotel that had about 6 rooms and a apartment complex with Belle. That was her name, and she had 2 daughters who rented from my mother. Belle O'Neill. She had 2 lovely daughters. Their name was Rebecca Banks and Emily Banks. They came from Louisiana, and my mother liked it. Belle even got Belle a job with her godfather, or at least my godfather, Mr. Prince, over there at the Groovy Grill. And to see how well Belle and Emily and Rebecca took care of me like a little brother that they never had. And so many people had taken care of me on Cobb Street. I mean, I was the only child, but I had so much love, and my mother made sure that these individuals that was in my life, she knew that they loved me because they loved her. And I'm so grateful to be around people like Miss Carolyn Land. These are people that knew my mother before I knew my mother. Marvin Neal, Marcella Neal, Barbara Neal. These people knew my mother before I even knew my mother. And to know how grateful I was to have a mother like Lillian. And to not only did she organize the first women's club, all women in the club was called the Ebonette Socialite Women Club. My mother started that club, and she also promoted that club, because every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, and even Halloween, she would always give a show and dance. That's how I met Mr. Bobby Bland, B.B. King, Joe Hinton, on and on and on, that I knew, them people knew my mother, because my mother would always book them people on these special nights. And also where she would have these people booked up as a place called the Grand Oaks, the El Dorado Ballroom. She would always book these people on these special nights, you know. And I'm talking about people that knew my mother and knew me when I got in radio, and I had to tell them who my mother was, like Mr. Bobby Bland, Mr. B.B. King. These people, my mother used to get, not only my mother, the Ebonette Socialite Club ladies would all pay their dues and raise money to bring these shows to town. That's where I got some of my entertainment from. My mother, Lillian Jones now. And she had a great husband that stood behind her, and that was Casey Jones. And he let my mother do whatever it took to bring money in the household, such as going out there promoting these different shows, and also having these ladies to meet at least once a week at our house, 3816 Cobb Street. And it was so nice to be able to be around my mother Yes, I was the only child, but you couldn't take it because anybody know Boo. Not Boo Lee, but Boo. They'll tell you, Lillian didn't take no mess. Lillian would always be on Boo's butt. Nobody on Carver Street caught as many whoopings as Boo. Boo was the man who cussed out the ice cream man. Boo was the one that got his hand caught in the soda water machine over there at the YMCA. And far as my mother was concerned, one of the best things that happened to me and happened to her is when they built the YMCA there on Ty-Western. On Sampson and Wheeler. And it's such nice to be able to come and document all of this about my mother.